the previous videos, we talked about the valuations rules for the variations which is claimable to provisional sum. There are quite a number of the conditions. Each of them has their own rules for the valuations. These rules of valuations are stated in the PAM contract 2018, and it is made transparent to the employer and the contractor. The purpose of setting this rule is so that whichever work related to the variations that was not initially agreed upon during the formations of the contract, which have the possibility leading to disagreement or dispute, by having these rules, these problems can be minimized. There will be a third party made of the professionals, either by the quantity surveyor or the architect, to facilitate the entire process. Due to various components of the conditions, this can be quite confusing and difficult to understand. With that, this flowchart may be adopted, giving us an idea the relevant rules of the valuations. This has been discussed in our previous videos. In these videos, we're going to extend our discussions to the variations which is claimable but not under the provisional sum. Previously, we did mention that there are two types of the variations. When it is claimable, it is either under the provisional sum or not under the provisional sum. If it is under the provisional sum, that means the relevant expenses has already been considered during bidding of the tender, and the relevant costs can be claimed from the provisional sum. However, if it is not claimed under the provisional sum, this means that there are going to be additional expenses to the project. With that, the process of claiming for these variations will be slightly different. In principles, whichever under the provisional sum is theoretically agreed upon the contractors and the employer. The contractor do not need to seek consent from the employer for the respective work to be entitled for the claim. However, when it comes to the variations not under the provisional sum, this will trigger additional expenses which the employer has no idea the relevant variation worth, how much will be the additional expenses. It is always a good practice for the contractor to make known to the employer regarding the implications in terms of the expenses as a result of the variations. Now we will look into the relevant details regarding the expenses not under the provisional sum. You know that the variations is by definition some modifications to the design, quality or quantity of the work which was not originally stated in the contract. For it to be triggered, there should be instructions from the architect. In the case that architect do not provide written instructions, the contractor will have to follow up with the written confirmations of architect instructions. This is to prove that the relevant instructions is coming from the architect on behalf of the employer. Now the variations is valid. The contractors has been made known of the requirement or the needs to have these variations. Knowing the relevant scope, before doing the work, the contractor will need to give written notice to the architect with an estimated additional expenses plus the necessary calculations, demonstrating to the architect for the employer to know the estimated amount of the total expenses as a result of these variations. This needs to be given within 28 days from the dates of the architect instructions or the confirmations of architect instruction. Of course, this is provided that the relevant work is entitled to additional expenses under the contract. Once this is done, the contractor may commence the work. After completing the work, within 28 days, the contractor needs to compile and complete the particulars for the claim plus the calculations. At this stage, the relevant expenses is more or less confirmed. The contractor needs to provide sufficient information to be eligible for the claim. Let's say now if the contractor is submitting the relevant information after 28 days, the relevant cost it will be borne by the contractor. By then, the contractor is deemed to waive his right to the additional expenses. That means whichever to be claimed for the relevant variation work, once the work is completed, the contractor needs to make the claim within 28 days. Beyond that, the employer has the right not to pay the contractor for the work. Now let us look at this timeline and the flowchart for us to have a better understanding regarding the claim for the variations. First, we know that under normal circumstances, the variations can trigger any time before the certificate of practical completions. Therefore, variations can happen somewhere in between the date of commencement and the date of completions. More specifically, it will be the certificate of practical completions. Now, at the date of commencement, there will be possessions of the site by the contractor and the work for the project is commenced. Somewhere in between, there is an instructions for the variations as given by the architect. If no variations involved, basically the contractor will just need to proceed with the work as per stated in the contract until the practical completions. When there is a variations, there should be instructions from the architect or the contractor will have to seek confirmations through the confirmations of architect instruction. Now we will need to identify whether the variations is claimable under the provisional sum. Let us settle the easy one. When it is claimable under the provisional sum, that means the relevant rules for the valuations of the work will apply. This can be referred from the clause 11.6. With that, the contractor will just need to carry out the variation work and complete the respective work. After that, submit claim and the valuations rules will apply. Now let's say that the variations is claimable not under the provisional sum. This comes back to the topic that we have discussed in this video, where the contractor will need to notify the architect regarding the estimated additional expenses that may incur due to the variations. With that, the contractor will need to submit a written notice plus the estimated expenses plus the relevant calculations to the architect within 28 days from the architect instructions or the confirmations of architect instruction. Having this notified to the architect, the contractor may proceed the work until completing the work for the variations. Once it is completed, within 28 days, the contractor must claim for the work. Otherwise, the contractor is deemed to waive his right to the additional expenses. So within 28 days, the contractor will need to submit the claim plus the particular and also plus the calculations to prove the entitlement for the claim.